When I walked into the office that evening and saw him sitting there, waiting for me, something in me shifted. He wasn't supposed to be there. Not at that hour, not with that look on his face. The building was nearly empty. Most had gone home, and I had returned for a folder I'd left behind. But there he was, my nephew, my intern, my temporary shadow for the last several weeks, sitting in the warm glow of my desk lamp like he belonged there. I hesitated in the doorway, searching for words I didn't have, pretending to look surprised. And he just smiled. That open, grateful smile I had seen a dozen times already. The kind that said, "You matter." My husband hadn't smiled like that in years. It would have been easy to call this moment harmless, to laugh it off or give a maternal nod and send him on his way. But I didn't. I sat across from him. I offered him tea. I lingered. When our eyes met across the table, there was something electric, subtle but undeniable. And still, I told myself, this is innocent. He looks up to me. He needs guidance. He's family. But later, in the silence of my car, I couldn't stop replaying the moment he said, "You work too hard. Someone should take care of you." I almost responded. I almost said, "No one ever does." But I bit my tongue. 3 months ago, I would have laughed at the idea of temptation. I was too old for that. Too tired. Too married. But now? Now I wasn't sure. And maybe that's how it all started. Before I tell you everything, how it began, how it spiraled, how I crossed lines I never imagined I would, answer me this in the comments. Have you ever ignored your instincts just because it felt good to be seen again? Some people say that long marriages die in silence. Ours died in noise, constant, tired, white noise. The hum of morning news, the beeping of unread emails, the click of utensils against plates at dinner where no one speaks unless it's about errands. Our house had become a polite waiting room for two people who used to love each other. That morning, I was brushing my hair in the mirror when I realized I didn't remember the last time my husband complimented me. Not in passing, not even for show. My reflection looked tired. Lipstick no longer felt necessary. My perfume sat unopened. We still shared a bed, but only out of habit, like hotel guests placed in the same room. When my sister called later that day and asked if I could help her son, my nephew, get a start in my department, I hesitated. Not because I didn't want to help, but because I didn't want the intrusion. I had gotten used to my rhythms, emails, deadlines, quiet lunches alone. But something in her voice softened me. "He's been lost since college," she said. "You always had a way of grounding people." I don't know if that was true, but I agreed. He arrived the following Monday. Tall, polite, understated. A little awkward, but sincere. He brought a notebook and 2 pens and looked at everything as if it mattered. I assigned him the smallest project I could find, a client summary we'd already archived, just to see how he handled it. He came back the next day with questions no one else had bothered to ask. For the first time in months, someone looked me in the eyes when I spoke. There was no tension, not at first. No fluttering in my chest or thoughts I needed to suppress. I saw him as a boy who needed help, and I was good at helping people. I offered him structure. He offered me, I don't know, reverence? Maybe that's what it was. The way his face lit up when I explained something. The way he said, "You make things make sense." My husband didn't notice the change in my routine. Or maybe he did and chose to ignore it. He left early, came home late, often ate in the study with his laptop open. We spoke more to the television than to each other. One evening, while we were cleaning the kitchen, I asked, "Do you want to go away for the weekend?" "Just us?" He barely looked up. "Too much going on at work," he said. "Maybe next month, then?" He shrugged. We'll see. And just like that, the invitation died in the air. I started wearing perfume again. Not for anyone. Just because I missed the way it made me feel. Like I was still a woman, not just a role. I changed my hairstyle, subtly, and bought a new blouse that felt a little too bright for the office. No one noticed. No one but him. You look different today, he said one afternoon as we were reviewing a spreadsheet together. I looked up. He was smiling. Do I? I asked. He hesitated, like he didn't want to overstep. In a good way. It was a compliment. Simple. Polite. But it landed like a drop in still water. After that, I caught myself watching him when he wasn't looking. The way he took notes. The way he fiddled with his pen when thinking. He was never inappropriate. Never flirtatious. Just present. Fully. He started staying late to help me finish reports. Said he didn't mind. You make work less boring, he joked once. I laughed too loudly. The evenings became quieter in the office. Just the two of us, focused, efficient. But every so often, I'd catch him glancing at me when he thought I wasn't looking. Once, our fingers touched as we reached for the same document. We both pulled back, and he apologized. It's fine, I said, and smiled. That weekend, my husband left for a business conference. He didn't offer details. I didn't ask. There was a time when I would have double-checked the itinerary, packed his bag, reminded him not to forget his charger. But now? I barely looked up from my screen. On Sunday, I passed by my dressing table and saw a framed photo from our wedding day. We looked like strangers dressed in someone else's happiness. I didn't cry. I just turned the frame face down. On Monday, he brought me coffee. Exactly how I liked it, milk first, 2 sugars, extra hot. I never told him that. Somehow, he remembered from a throwaway comment weeks earlier. It's silly, he said, setting it down. But you deserve good coffee. I wanted to say something light, something casual. But all that came out was a quiet, thank you. He smiled. And I held his gaze for one breath too long. That night, I didn't sleep. I lay in bed beside a man who hadn't touched me in months and thought about another who hadn't touched me at all, but had seen me. Really seen me. I didn't know what this was. I didn't know what it meant. But I knew this, for the first time in years, I was waking up. And part of me didn't want to go back to sleep. The office was nearly silent when the lights flickered once and went out completely, leaving us in a dim hush broken only by the low hum of emergency lighting. I was halfway through reviewing a set of documents on my screen when the power failure caught us off guard. I glanced up and saw him still seated across from me, blinking in the half-dark. That's strange, I said quietly, more to myself than to him. He gave a small laugh and shrugged, then looked toward the windows. Outside, the city remained alive, the traffic lights blinking, people still moving. It wasn't a citywide outage, just our floor, apparently. I stood and walked to the doorway to check the hall. Empty, darker than usual. The rest of the office had gone home hours ago. We were the only two left. The realization settled over me not as a threat but as an awareness. There were no witnesses. No distractions. Just me, him, and the space between. I guess we should wait it out, he said, his voice softer now. I nodded, returning to my chair. There wasn't much else to do. The computers were useless, and the server had kicked us out of the system. For a while, we sat in that quiet, both pretending to stay focused on work that couldn't be done. Minutes passed, maybe more. The quiet stretched. He shifted in his seat, then leaned back and looked at me. "Can I ask you something?" I turned my head. "Of course." "Do you ever feel like you're not really seen anymore? Like people only talk to your title, not to you?" I was taken aback by the honesty of the question. I could have brushed it off with a neutral comment, kept it professional. But the shadows, the hour, the moment, it felt like truth was the only acceptable currency. "Yes," I said after a pause. "I feel that way often." He nodded slowly, not prying further. Just sitting with the answer. Something in the air shifted then, quietly. A weight we hadn't acknowledged until it floated to the surface. I didn't know how it happened exactly. One second I was glancing toward the hallway again, wondering if the lights might flicker back on, and the next I turned to meet his eyes. They weren't searching or suggestive. They were simply open, present. And then, without warning, we kissed. We kissed. The moment lasted only seconds, but it rang out through my body like a bell, clear and resounding. I felt his breath against mine, warm and unsure, and then I pulled back. I stood almost immediately. Not abruptly, not dramatically, just enough to sever the closeness. I walked a few steps to the window, pressed my fingertips against the cold glass. Below, people bustled through their lives unaware of mine unraveling just slightly in this room. He didn't move or speak. He respected the space between us, though I could feel the question radiating off him. I didn't have an answer to give. My heart was hammering in my chest, not from fear, not from desire, but from something messier. A recognition. A warning. When I turned back, I smiled lightly, as though we'd merely shared a quiet moment of laughter. I walked over and picked up my purse, now pointless since we weren't working anymore. "I should go," I said, my voice even. He stood, but didn't follow. "Okay." That was all. No confrontation. No desperate explanations. Just that word, and his gaze following me to the door. Outside, the hallway seemed longer than usual. As I walked toward the elevator, I felt the echo of what had happened cling to my skin. It wasn't guilt yet. Not quite. But it was something. Something I would carry home with me. When I stepped into the apartment, my husband was seated at the dining table with his laptop open and a takeout container beside him. The television played softly in the background, news murmuring about stocks and policies and rain forecasts. "You're late," he said, not looking up. "Power outage," I replied, slipping off my shoes. "Got stuck for a while." He nodded. His fork clinked against the plastic tray as he returned to eating. No follow-up questions. No curiosity. I stood in the doorway of the bedroom for a few moments later that night, watching him prepare for bed in silence. He didn't speak. I didn't either. Our routines overlapped without touching. When I finally lay down beside him, I stared at the ceiling and let my thoughts scatter like leaves in a sudden wind. I replayed the moment in the office again and again. The quiet between us. The way he looked at me like I wasn't invisible. Like I wasn't just the head of department or wife or figure of responsibility, but a woman. A person. It terrified me how much I'd needed that. At some point, I must have fallen asleep, though my dreams were restless. In the morning, he had already left by the time I woke. No note, no message. At work, things between us, the boy and me, shifted subtly. We kept our distance. No touching. No long eye contact. We addressed each other with the careful precision of two people who had danced too close to fire and weren't sure how badly they'd been burned. But every once in a while, our fingers would graze over a shared document or I'd hear his breath catch when I walked past. We said nothing. That, somehow, was louder than words. And yet, deep inside, something had begun. A tiny fracture in the wall I'd built around myself. A crack that let in light and danger. I spent that week hyper-aware of my movements. I changed the way I walked, the way I spoke. I was afraid someone in the office would see something I didn't even fully understand myself. But no one seemed to notice. Only him. Only me. There were no plans. No fantasies. No elaborate ideas of what might happen next. Just the knowledge that something irreversible had occurred. And beneath the calm exterior I worked so hard to maintain, a question pulsed quietly in my veins. Was this the beginning of something, or the beginning of the end? I didn't have an answer. But I knew I was no longer the woman I'd been a week ago. I arrived at the office earlier than usual, hoping the quiet might offer some clarity. The hallway was dim, untouched by the usual morning chatter and footsteps. I unlocked my office door and slipped inside, savoring the stillness. There was comfort in routine, even now, when my routine had begun to crack and shift in ways I hadn't anticipated. I hadn't seen him since the night of the power outage. He had kept his distance, and I hadn't sought him out either. But the memory lingered, softer now, but persistent. I had managed to convince myself that it was a mistake, a lapse, a moment that meant nothing more than what it was. But I didn't entirely believe it. I wasn't that naive. The truth was less tidy than I liked to admit. The coffee on my desk tasted bitter, or maybe it was just my mood. I stared at the computer screen, half reading emails, half listening to the murmur of the office waking up. Around mid-morning, he stepped quietly into my doorway, holding a folder. "I finished the quarterly update you asked for," he said, his voice steady but without its usual lightness. I reached out and took the file from his hands without meeting his eyes. "Thank you," I replied, then turned to place it on the desk. He hesitated for a second, then nodded and left without another word. I exhaled as soon as the door clicked shut. There was a strain now, one I had tried to avoid. It wasn't tension born from resentment, it was the weight of something unspoken, the kind of silence that fills the space after something real has happened and no one knows how to name it. That afternoon, I stopped by the drugstore on the way home to pick up something trivial, lotion, maybe, or toothpaste. I wandered the aisles longer than I needed to, not because I couldn't find what I was looking for, but because I didn't want to go home. When I finally did, the house was dark. My husband wasn't there, though he was supposed to be. A note on the fridge said he had a dinner meeting, written in his impersonal scrawl. I stood there reading it, then rereading it, as if the words might shift if I stared long enough. The silence in our home was different from the silence in the office. At work, the quiet hummed with tension. At home, it was just absence. It didn't ache, it simply reminded me of what wasn't there. I made myself tea and sat by the window. The late autumn sun painted the street in long shadows. Across the road, a mother was picking up scattered toys from her front yard. Her child clung to her leg, giggling. I watched them, wondering when I had last laughed like that. When I had last been touched, not in a polite gesture, not in a quick goodbye kiss, but touched with intention, with care. Later that night, I found myself standing in front of my wardrobe, staring at a blouse I hadn't worn in years. It was soft blue, flattering, just a little too elegant for the office. I tried it on, not for anyone else, just to see if it still fit the way I remembered. It did. I didn't wear it the next day, but I left it hanging where I could see it. The next week passed quietly, though not peacefully. I noticed him avoiding the break room when I was there. If we had to speak, we did so quickly, politely. It was unbearable in its civility. I had never known how loud distance could be until now. One morning, I caught a glimpse of him talking to a colleague by the elevator. He laughed at something she said. It was an easy, warm sound. The kind of laugh that used to be directed at me. I wasn't jealous, I knew that wasn't the right word. But I felt a sharpness, a tug of something I didn't want to name. That evening, as I packed up to leave, I realized I had left a folder in the conference room. I walked back through the dim hallways, my heels echoing against the tile. The building had emptied again, and I moved through it like a ghost retracing her steps. I found the folder where I had left it, tucked beneath a stack of unused chairs. As I turned to leave, I saw him approaching from the other side of the hallway. Our eyes met, and for a moment, neither of us spoke. "You forgot this," he said, holding out a small USB drive. It was still in the laptop. "Thank you," I replied, reaching out to take it. As our hands touched, something passed between us, nothing dramatic, just an acknowledgement. Of the past. Of what still lingered. Of what might have been. We didn't say anything more. I stepped back. He nodded. We walked in opposite directions. The next morning, I woke before my alarm and found myself sitting in the kitchen, stirring coffee I didn't want. My husband entered the room quietly, nodded a greeting, and reached for the cereal box. We moved around each other like two planets caught in distant orbit, never colliding, never connecting. "I might be late tonight," he said, his voice flat. "There's a thing at the firm." I nodded. Okay. Neither of us asked questions anymore. There were no arguments, no accusations. Just a hollowed-out routine where intimacy used to live. That night, after he left, I sat on the couch and scrolled through old photographs on my phone. Birthdays. Vacations. Smiles. Laughter. All frozen in time. I kept stopping at one in particular, taken 5 years ago, at a beach we visited during a spontaneous weekend trip. We looked happy. And maybe we were. Back then. I don't know when we stopped trying. Maybe it happened slowly. Maybe it was just life, creeping in with bills and meetings and missed anniversaries. But sitting there, staring at those images, I realized how far we had drifted. Not just from each other, but from ourselves. And yet, I didn't want to be the kind of person who blamed time for everything. I didn't want to wake up one day and say, "I don't know how this happened." Because I did know. I was there. Every moment. Every choice. Every silence. When I finally went to bed, the house felt colder than usual. The shadows seemed longer. I wrapped the blanket tighter around my shoulders, closed my eyes, and listened to the sound of nothing. The next day, I wore the soft blue blouse. And for the first time in a long time, I felt like I was dressing for myself. Not for work. Not for him. Not even for the boy whose presence still lingered in the corners of my thoughts. Just for me. He noticed. Of course he did. His glance was quick, discreet. But I caught it. And when our eyes met across the conference table, we didn't smile. We didn't speak. But something had shifted again. And this time, I didn't look away. The invitation came unexpectedly, tucked into the end of a long meeting, almost as an afterthought. He approached my desk after most of the team had filtered out, carrying a document I didn't immediately recognize. I took it from him, scanning the front page without much thought, until I reached the heading, Regional Development Conference, Preliminary Agenda. I looked up. He was watching me carefully, hands in his pockets, trying not to look like he was waiting for a reaction. "They asked me to attend," he said. "And they thought maybe, if you were available, you could supervise the presentation part. Since I'm still under your mentorship." It was phrased professionally, politely, almost casually. But we both knew better. The conference was out of town, 2 days, 1 overnight stay. The suggestion was layered. And yet, it wasn't inappropriate. Not exactly. Not on paper. I nodded slowly, trying to keep my expression neutral. I'll think about it, I said. For the rest of the day, I felt the weight of that folder in my bag like a question pressing against my side. I didn't have an answer. Not yet. But I thought about it as I drove home, the city rolling past my windows in muted grays and oranges, the hum of traffic replacing the noise in my head. When I entered the house, I was met with silence. The kind that greeted me like a well-worn coat, familiar, heavy, and indifferent. My husband's briefcase was on the bench by the stairs, his shoes near the door, but he was nowhere to be seen. I heard the television from the den, the low murmur of voices that never spoke to either of us directly. I placed the folder on the kitchen counter and began preparing dinner out of habit. Not hunger. Habit. The same movements, the same utensils, the same plates. Nothing had changed, and yet everything felt different. At some point, he walked in. We exchanged the usual phrases: "How was your day? Long meeting, traffic was terrible, leftovers okay." It was all script, recited without thought, a language we spoke fluently yet felt nothing for. Later that night, while he dozed on the couch with the TV still on, I opened the conference folder again. I read through the agenda, the hotel information, the speaker list. Everything looked legitimate. Safe. Professional. And yet the thought of being away from this house, from the silence, from the routine, it stirred something in me. I submitted my confirmation the next morning. The week leading up to the trip was filled with small details, coordinating travel, finalizing presentations, reminding myself that this was just work. Just work. But underneath that, a hum of awareness pulsed, quiet but persistent. On the day we left, I packed lightly. Just enough for 2 days. Conservative choices. Neutral colors. But I added one item at the last moment, a soft scarf I hadn't worn in years, tucked deep in the corner of the suitcase. Not for him. Not for anyone. For me. The train ride to the conference city was uneventful. We sat across from each other in a quiet car, laptops open, documents spread between us. We spoke minimally, our words clipped and task-focused. But every now and then, our eyes met, and in those brief moments, entire conversations passed without sound. The hotel was modest but clean. 2 separate rooms, of course. On different floors. I checked in first, then waited in the lobby while he finished at the counter. We made our way to the conference center for the evening reception, a networking event, mostly full of unfamiliar faces, tepid wine, and recycled conversation. He stayed close but never too close. Just enough that I felt his presence like a current in the air. At one point, he leaned toward me slightly, voice low. "You're good at this," he said. "Everyone notices." I turned to him, surprised. At what? Commanding a room. Being the person people listen to. I hadn't realized I still could. I smiled, a small one. "Thank you." We didn't linger long. After an hour, we quietly excused ourselves from the reception and made our way back to the hotel. The elevator ride was silent. Not awkward, just full. Full of the things we weren't saying. When we reached my floor, the doors opened. I turned to him. "Good night," I said. He nodded. "Good night." I walked down the hall and unlocked my room. I didn't close the door right away. I don't know why. Maybe I needed a moment. Maybe I expected the air to feel heavier. It didn't. It just felt quiet. I changed out of my conference attire and into something comfortable. Sat by the window. Watched the city lights flicker below. I didn't turn on the TV. I didn't check my phone. A knock came. Soft. Hesitant. But unmistakable. I didn't move at first. I just stared at the door, the outline of his shadow beneath it. Then I stood. Walked over. Opened it. We didn't speak. He looked at me, not hungrily, not desperately. Just openly. Fully. I stepped aside. And he walked in. I closed the door behind him, the soft click echoing louder than it should have. We stood there for a moment, facing each other in the soft hotel lamplight. No grand gestures. No cinematic words. Just presence. We spent the night together. In the morning, I woke before he did. The room was quiet, filled with the faint sound of distant traffic and the steady rhythm of his breathing. I sat up slowly, careful not to disturb him, and reached for the hotel notepad on the nightstand. I didn't know what I planned to write. Maybe nothing. I watched him for a few minutes, studying the way his features softened in sleep. There was no regret. Not in that moment. But there was weight. There was knowing. I took a shower. Dressed. Packed my things. He stirred as I zipped my bag. I turned to him, offered a quiet, "We should head down soon." He nodded, his voice rough with sleep. Okay. We didn't speak of it again, not then, not on the train, not in the office. But it had happened. And nothing could undo that. Not the silence. Not the professionalism. Not even the deliberate distance we reinstated the moment we returned. The rest of the week passed like a film running in the background of my life. Meetings. Reports. Small talk in the break room. But beneath it all, something had shifted in me. I didn't feel triumphant. I didn't feel guilty. I felt awake. For better or worse, I was awake. Returning to the office after the conference felt almost surreal. The familiar walls, the routine rhythms, the same sounds and smells, they hadn't changed, but I had. I walked through the corridors with a different awareness, not just of myself but of him. And of the space between us, which now held the memory of something irreversible. No one noticed, of course. The office carried on, humming with the usual emails, meetings, and printer jams. We spoke when we needed to. Briefly. Clearly. But underneath the surface of every shared sentence was the weight of what had happened. I had expected the guilt to settle in fully once I returned to my normal surroundings. I had expected the crash, the regret, the self-loathing. But none of that came. Instead, I felt oddly quiet inside. Not calm, more like muted. Like someone had turned the volume down on everything else. At home, my husband didn't ask about the conference. I don't think he even remembered I had gone. He was immersed in another week of late evenings, conference calls, and meetings I was no longer invited to care about. We spoke in passing, like coworkers who shared a kitchen but not a connection. It was a rainy Thursday when something unexpected shook me. I had left work late, again. Not because I had to, but because I didn't want to go home just yet. The storm outside was heavy and relentless, and by the time I reached the parking garage, the streets were already slick with water. My umbrella flipped inside out from the wind, and I was soaked from the knees down before I even got to the car. When I opened the door, I found him standing beside his own car, parked not far from mine. He hadn't seen me yet. He was on the phone, voice raised slightly, not angry but urgent. His expression was tight, brows drawn, eyes down. I couldn't hear the words, only the tone. He ended the call with a sharp sigh and leaned against the car, dragging a hand through his wet hair. I hesitated. I should have kept walking. But I didn't. "Everything all right?" I asked, stepping into view. He turned toward me, startled at first, then softened. Yeah. Just family stuff. I didn't press. He didn't offer. For a moment, we just stood there, both drenched, our clothes clinging to our skin. You look like you walked through a hurricane, he said. I smiled faintly. Felt like it. He opened his passenger door and reached inside, pulling out his blazer. Without asking, he stepped forward and draped it over my shoulders. The fabric was warm, slightly dry, carrying the faint scent of his cologne. I stood very still. We should get out of this rain, I said. Yeah, he nodded. But neither of us moved right away. We kissed. We kissed. There was no build-up, no glance for permission. Just a moment suspended in the chaos of weather and silence, and then it happened. Soft, brief, but certain. When we parted, he stepped back first. I'm sorry, he said. I'm not, I replied. That night, I sat in my car outside the house for nearly 20 minutes before going inside. The lights were on. The television buzzed faintly through the walls. I imagined my husband where he always was, on the couch, one leg curled beneath him, reading emails during commercial breaks. When I walked through the door, I expected to feel different. To feel like a traitor. But instead, all I felt was the hollowness I'd been ignoring for months. Years, maybe. The real betrayal hadn't been that moment in the parking lot. It had happened slowly, over time, in forgotten birthdays and unanswered questions, in the absence of laughter, in the cold routines we called love. The next morning, I found him in the kitchen pouring coffee. I'm thinking of going to visit my sister next weekend, I said, testing the waters. He nodded without looking up. Okay. Just me, I added. He took a sip, then placed the cup down. Whatever you need. That was it. No questions. No curiosity. No emotion. Just permission, as if I were a guest in my own life. At work, I kept to myself. He did too. We didn't cross paths unless we had to, and when we did, we were careful. But the silence between us had changed. It wasn't cold anymore. It was charged. And it made everything else feel more vivid. I began to notice things I hadn't before, the smell of coffee in the break room, the rhythm of footsteps in the hallway, the way the office light shifted in the late afternoon. Everything seemed more alive, more immediate. And yet, I couldn't enjoy any of it fully. Not when I still felt split down the middle. One afternoon, as I passed by his desk, he looked up. Just a glance. But it lingered. Later that day, he left a note on my desk, folded in half. No name, just a single line. I don't know how to be around you anymore without feeling everything. I didn't write back. That evening, my husband told me he had been invited to a partner retreat. It's next weekend, he said. A few days in Napa. Should be good for business. I nodded, stirring soup that neither of us really wanted to eat. Sounds nice. He didn't ask if I wanted to come. I didn't ask if he wanted me there. We spent the rest of the evening in the same room, but worlds apart. That night in bed, I stared at the ceiling for a long time. I thought about all the ways I had compromised myself over the years. All the times I had chosen silence over confrontation. Loneliness over conflict. Stability over honesty. And now, I had chosen something else. I didn't know where it would lead. I wasn't even sure if I wanted it to lead anywhere. But I knew that something inside me had shifted irreversibly. The version of me that had accepted being unseen, untouched, unheard, that version was dissolving. And in her place was someone else. Someone awake. Someone uncertain. But someone alive. The weekend came sooner than I expected, though time had begun to blur in ways I couldn't quite measure. My husband left on Friday morning for his retreat, barely kissing me on the cheek before disappearing through the front door. His suitcase had been packed the night before, efficiently, without my help, without any question of whether I would accompany him. We had become two people with separate itineraries, intersecting only when absolutely necessary. The silence that followed his departure wasn't heavy, it was liberating. For the first time in a long while, I wasn't performing. I didn't have to smile at breakfast, didn't have to feign interest in his meetings, didn't have to fold myself into the shape of the woman I used to be for him. I moved through the house freely, barefoot, hair unbrushed, coffee in hand, the sunlight pouring through the windows like quiet permission. I didn't intend to do anything. I had no plan. But I also didn't stop myself when I picked up my phone and typed out a short message. "Are you free for lunch?" He responded within minutes. "Yes." "When and where?" I chose a quiet cafe on the edge of the city, the kind of place where no one knew my name. It had large windows, a soft hum of background noise, and a certain anonymity that felt comforting. I wore something simple, nothing too careful, but not careless either. A soft sweater, dark jeans, minimal makeup. Just enough to feel like myself. The version of myself I used to know, before routine buried her. He was already there when I arrived, seated at a small table by the window, a book closed on the table beside his coffee. He stood when he saw me, and for a moment, neither of us spoke. The last time we had been alone like this was the night we kissed in the rain. It felt like days ago and years ago all at once. We sat. Ordered. Talked about nothing at first. Work. The weather. The coffee. But beneath the surface, something simmered, an awareness neither of us could quite contain. When the plates were cleared, and the space between us held only what we hadn't yet said, I looked at him and finally broke the silence. "This can't happen again." He didn't pretend not to know what I meant. He nodded slowly, his expression unreadable. "I know." But I wasn't sure he did. Or if I did. I looked out the window, watching the world go by in slow, deliberate movements. "I'm not who you think I am," I said, the words tasting foreign in my mouth. "I'm not spontaneous. I don't make reckless choices. I don't." "You're not reckless," he interrupted gently. "You're just tired of being invisible." I met his eyes then. And there it was, clarity. He wasn't trying to seduce me. He wasn't even asking for anything. He just saw me. In a way no one had for years. I reached for my cup, found it empty, and set it down again. "I don't know what I'm doing," I admitted. "That makes two of us." We left without touching. Without promises. Without decisions. But as I walked back to my car, I knew something had changed, not between us, but within me. That evening, the sky turned a deep gray. Rain threatened but never arrived. I cooked a simple dinner for myself, poured a glass of wine, and sat by the window, watching the wind move the trees like dancers who had forgotten the steps. I thought about the years I had spent keeping everything together. The marriage. The house. The image. I had done it well. No one ever suspected I was lonely. No one ever asked if I was happy. Maybe they assumed I was. Maybe I assumed it too, for a long time. But something about being seen, truly seen, had shifted everything. Not because it led to something reckless or forbidden. But because it reminded me I was still here. Still alive. Still capable of desire. Of choice. The next day, I went for a walk through the park near our house. I hadn't been there in years, not since my husband and I used to take Sunday strolls, back when we still made time for things like that. The leaves were beginning to turn, painting the paths in shades of gold and rust. I sat on a bench beneath a tall maple and watched people pass. Couples holding hands. Children racing ahead of their parents. Runners with earbuds, lost in other worlds. I was alone, but not lonely. For the first time in a long while, I felt still. Not restless. Not aching. Just still. That night, I cleaned out a drawer in our bedroom. Not because it needed cleaning, but because I needed the gesture. I found an old photograph of us, my husband and me, on a beach years ago. We were smiling, barefoot, sunburned. I remembered that trip. We laughed a lot then. We made plans. We held hands. I didn't cry when I looked at the photo. I didn't feel sad. Just reflective. That woman in the picture, she had hope. She believed in things. I wasn't sure if I still did. The next morning, he came home. Suitcase in hand, tie slightly loosened, eyes tired. Trip was fine, he said, setting the bag by the stairs. Long, but fine. I nodded. I'm glad. We moved around each other like always. Comfortable. Distant. Predictable. But something inside me had rearranged. A quiet shift. A different alignment. Later, while he was in the shower, I stood in the hallway and looked at the closed door. I didn't feel anger. Or betrayal. Or guilt. Just distance. A chasm that had widened long before anyone else came into the picture. I walked away. Back in the kitchen, I made tea. Sat at the table. Let the silence stretch. The rain finally arrived that evening. Soft at first, then steady. I stood at the window and watched it fall, washing the city in silver. I wondered how long it had been since I felt the rain without flinching. Without running for cover. When he emerged from the bathroom, hair damp, sleeves rolled, he paused in the doorway. Want to watch something? He asked. Not tonight, I replied. He nodded. Didn't press. I returned to my chair by the window and let the night settle around me. I didn't know what tomorrow would bring. But I knew this, I couldn't go back. Not to pretending. Not to silence. Not to vanishing inside my own life. I didn't know what forward looked like yet. But I was done standing still. He was standing by the copier when I walked into the office Monday morning. The room smelled like fresh paper and toner, the hum of machines a low backdrop to the silence between us. Our eyes met for a moment, just long enough to acknowledge, but nothing passed between us except familiarity. We didn't speak. I passed him, coffee in hand, pretending to check my phone. The truth was, I didn't know what to say. It had been days since the kiss in the rain, and even longer since the weekend I had spent mostly alone, reevaluating the life I thought I had built with care. He hadn't reached out again. Neither had I. But something lived in the air now, quiet and fragile, like the last notes of a song we were both afraid to hum aloud. The day passed without incident. I buried myself in reports and spreadsheets, feigning focus with the dedication of someone who had something to hide. But I didn't feel like I was hiding. Not anymore. I felt suspended. Like I was between two lives, one I had lived by default, and one that was still undefined, unnamed. When I returned home that night, the house was dim. My husband had left a note on the counter, working late. Leftovers in the fridge. His handwriting was rushed, a habit of his, and I found myself staring at it longer than necessary. It was strange, the intimacy we used to find in little things, notes, texts, shared glances. Now, even his handwriting looked unfamiliar, like something I was only supposed to recognize. I didn't eat. Instead, I took a long bath, letting the water scald my skin just enough to remind me I was still in it. Still present. Still real. And then, for reasons I couldn't explain, I sent him a message. Not my husband. Him. Can we talk? The response came quickly. Of course. Where? I didn't want a public place. I didn't want the tension of sitting across from him, stirring tea and avoiding everything we weren't allowed to say. Here, I replied. After 8. The hours between then and his arrival passed slowly. I straightened the living room, then messed it up again, rearranging pillows, lighting a candle, then blowing it out. I changed my clothes twice, settled on something neutral. When I finally sat down, it was only to stand up again seconds later, restless in a body that hadn't yet caught up with the decision my mind had already made. He rang the bell at 8:06. I opened the door without checking the peephole. He stepped inside cautiously, looking around as though the house might speak before either of us did. I closed the door behind him and motioned toward the living room. He followed without a word. We sat opposite each other, a small table between us. I folded my hands. Unfolded them. Thank you for coming, I said finally. He nodded once, serious but not cold. I needed to see you, I added. I wasn't sure if I should reach out again, he said. I didn't want to make things harder. They're already hard, I said, not bitterly, just truthfully. Not because of you. Not only because of you. He looked down, then up. Tell me what you need. And for a second, I didn't know. I had rehearsed explanations in my head. Apologies, maybe. Boundaries. But none of them fit now. None of them held the weight of what I truly felt. So I told him the truth. I needed someone to see me, I said. And you did. That scared me. He didn't speak. I don't know what I'm doing. I don't know where this goes. But I know I can't pretend anymore that nothing's changed. He nodded again, but slower this time. Like he understood. We don't have to name it, he said quietly. We don't have to fix it, or even follow it. But we can be honest. That word, honest, it landed heavily. For so long, honesty in my marriage had meant stability. Politeness. Predictability. But real honesty? The kind that opens doors you can't close again? That had been absent for a long time. I reached for the glass of water beside me. Took a slow sip. The quiet between us was not awkward. It was full. Contained. Safe, somehow. I think I've stopped loving him, I said, not looking at him. But I don't know when it happened. He didn't answer. He didn't need to. We sat like that for some time. Not as lovers. Not as conspirators. Just as two people who had stepped outside the bounds of what was expected, and were now looking at each other with the kind of clarity that only exists when there's nothing left to hide behind. And then I said it. We spent the night together. I didn't mean the words to hang in the air the way they did. I wasn't referring to just him and me. I was practicing. Saying it aloud. Owning it. And it changed everything. Because now it was real. It had a shape. A voice. It was no longer a moment I could erase with silence or justify with circumstance. He looked at me, not with guilt, not with pity, but with that same unwavering gaze he always gave me. As if he saw me, completely, and still chose to stay. I know, he said. Later, when he left, we didn't hug. Didn't touch. The door closed behind him softly, and I stood for a long moment in the quiet. Upstairs, the bed was neatly made, untouched. I lay down on top of the covers, fully dressed, and stared at the ceiling. There was no guilt. No pride. Just breath. Just truth. Just the quiet, waiting to become something else. The house was quiet when I woke the next morning, though quiet wasn't unusual anymore. I'd become used to the soft rustle of nothingness, no voices, no movement, just the occasional creak of the floor settling or the hum of the fridge behind the kitchen wall. My husband had left early, his absence marked by a mug left out on the counter and a bathroom mirror still fogged with steam. No note. No goodbye. Just a vacuum where once there had been connection. I stood in front of the mirror longer than I needed to, toothbrush in hand, mouth still full of mint. My reflection looked like someone I had met recently but didn't know well. Familiar but altered. There was a sharpness in my eyes now, not bitterness, but alertness. A kind of emotional sobriety that had taken root in me since that night. The day passed in a haze of small tasks, laundry folded, dishes rinsed, a few errands completed more out of obligation than necessity. I barely spoke to anyone, and the silence no longer felt strange. If anything, it felt earned. I was processing something I still didn't have words for. That evening, I poured a glass of wine and sat on the back steps just as the sun was beginning to lower itself into the horizon. The sky was streaked with pale orange and soft blue, and the breeze smelled faintly of cut grass. It was a simple moment, but I clung to it, needing something still, something grounded. I had no plans to speak to my husband that night about anything significant. There was no script prepared, no confrontation scheduled. But some part of me had begun preparing for the unraveling, not because I wanted to destroy what was left between us, but because pretending was becoming more exhausting than facing the truth. When he came through the door just past 8, I didn't say anything right away. He looked tired, or maybe just distracted, the way he always did lately. He placed his keys on the table and took off his shoes, then moved toward the kitchen with the familiarity of habit. I watched him for a moment, thinking about all the small routines we'd built over the years, rituals that once held intimacy but now only reinforced the distance between us. We had dinner without much conversation. He scrolled through his phone between bites. I didn't ask what he was reading. I didn't comment on the silence. I was observing, more than participating. After we cleared the plates, I stood by the sink for a while, rinsing each dish slowly, methodically. He stood behind me, leaning on the counter, the weight of his body folding into the marble. I could feel his eyes on me, but I didn't turn around. And then he spoke. "I need to tell you something." I stopped moving. I didn't turn the faucet off. I didn't dry my hands. I just stood there, back to him, waiting. "I should have told you months ago," he continued. "Maybe even years. But I kept thinking it would pass. That I could fix it without hurting you." I finally turned. His face was serious, but not defensive. Not calculating. Just tired. Human. "There was someone," he said. The words didn't hit like a blow. They landed more like a confirmation, a quiet clicking into place of something I'd always suspected but never dared to face head-on. A puzzle piece long lost, now suddenly found, smooth and inevitable. I nodded. Slowly. "I know," I said. He blinked. "You do?" "I didn't have proof," I said. "But I knew." We stood in silence for what felt like minutes. Not angry silence. Not even accusatory. Just silence that had waited too long for its turn to speak. He looked away first, hands in his pockets, jaw tight. "It's over," he said. I nodded again. Not because it made anything better, but because I believed him. Because I had to. "I didn't know how to say it," he added. "I didn't want to lose everything." I let the words hang. I didn't correct him. I didn't say that maybe we'd lost everything long before the confession. I didn't remind him that what we had now wasn't exactly something to fight for. I simply asked, why now? He sighed. Because I see you disappearing. And I don't want to wake up one day and realize you're just gone. I leaned back against the sink, arms crossed, unsure of what to feel. I already feel gone, I said. He looked at me then, really looked at me, maybe for the first time in years. There was something in his eyes, remorse, maybe. Or recognition. Or fear. I wasn't sure which. I don't hate you, I said. But I'm tired. He stepped forward, slightly, then stopped himself. I want to try, he said. Try what? I asked. To fix this? He didn't answer right away. I don't know. To start over, maybe. It was strange how those words, spoken in a different time, might have made my heart leap. But now, they felt weightless. Like an apology too delayed to change the outcome. I don't know if I can, I replied. He nodded, once. Not defeated, just understanding. I guess we should take time, he said. I didn't respond. Later, after he had gone upstairs, I sat alone in the living room, the television playing low, ignored. My phone buzzed once. A message from him. Not my husband. Just a single sentence. Are you okay? I didn't reply. I placed the phone face down on the table and closed my eyes. Not because I was ashamed. Not because I regretted anything. But because I knew I had stepped over a line, and there was no going back. Not for him. Not for my husband. Not for me. I was in the in-between now. And I had to decide whether to build a bridge or burn the path behind me. The next morning arrived without ceremony. No bright light through the curtains, no dramatic sense of conclusion. Just the soft patter of early rain against the windows, and the smell of coffee my husband had already brewed before leaving for the office. I heard the front door close softly as I sat up in bed, my body heavy with the weight of what we hadn't resolved the night before. The confession had been made. On both sides, in a way. He with his past affair, and me with the truth I hadn't spoken aloud but had already lived. Neither of us had reacted with rage or despair. We didn't fall into shouting matches or tears. Instead, there was just quiet. Mutual recognition. The kind of silence that grows between two people who have stopped pretending but haven't yet found the strength to decide what comes next. The house was still. I lingered over my morning routine, tea instead of coffee, a long shower with the door open to let the steam spill freely into the hallway, and then I dressed slowly, choosing a soft gray sweater and dark pants. Neutral. Balanced. Not hiding, not inviting. Just existing. I walked into the office that day knowing something had shifted. Not visibly, not in the way I moved or spoke, but deep inside me, in the place where decisions take root. I wasn't afraid anymore, not of being caught, not of being questioned, not of what people might think if they ever found out. What frightened me now was something far quieter, the idea of living the rest of my life without ever choosing myself again. He was already at his desk when I arrived. He didn't look up, not right away, but I knew he felt me enter the room. I could sense it in the way his posture straightened slightly, the way his fingers hesitated over the keyboard. I didn't say anything. Just walked past and sat down in my own office, closing the door behind me with a softness that felt intentional. The morning passed in quiet productivity. Emails, reports, a few meetings that required nothing from me beyond nods and carefully measured responses. It was only near lunch that a knock came on my door. I looked up. It was him. I have the quarterly draft, he said. I nodded. Come in. He stepped inside, handed me the folder, then paused. I didn't look up right away. I scanned the document slowly, flipping through the pages even though I knew I wouldn't absorb a single word. "You didn't respond to my message," he said after a long silence. I set the folder down, finally meeting his eyes. They weren't accusing. Just searching. "I didn't know what to say," I replied. "I still don't." He nodded, accepting the answer. There was nothing more said. No request for explanation. No plea for clarity. He simply stood there for a moment longer, then turned and left. I sat back in my chair and closed my eyes. The air felt heavier now. Not suffocating, but filled with something unnamed. By the time the workday ended, I knew what I needed to do. I waited until most of the office had emptied. The sky outside had turned pale with the early evening. The city was beginning to exhale its weekday exhaustion, and I could hear the distant rhythm of tires on wet pavement. I found him in the hallway, sorting through a stack of papers. He looked up as I approached. "Do you have a moment?" I asked. He nodded, without hesitation, and followed me to the small conference room near the back of the floor. It was rarely used at this hour. Inside, the light was softer, the air still. I closed the door behind us. We sat across from each other at the table. I folded my hands. Unfolded them. "I told him," I said finally. His brow furrowed slightly. "Told him what?" "That we're not okay. That I'm not okay. That something broke a long time ago and we've just been pretending it's fixable." He exhaled slowly. "Did you tell him about us?" I shook my head. "No. Not in words. But I think he knows." We sat in silence for a few long seconds. Then I continued. "I don't regret what happened between us," I said. "But I also don't know what it means. I didn't come here to make promises or ask for any." His expression didn't change. He just listened. I needed to tell the truth. At least part of it. Because I can't go back to living like I don't matter in my own life. He nodded, slowly. "You do matter." His words were simple. But they felt real. "I'm not asking you to wait," I said. "Or to make space in your life for something uncertain. I just needed to say it out loud." He leaned forward slightly, resting his arms on the table. "I never expected anything," he said. "But I'm glad you told him. Not for me, but for you." We didn't hug. Didn't reach across the table. We simply sat there, two people in a quiet room, acknowledging something that had begun without permission and grown in the spaces we never meant to leave empty. When I got home that night, my husband was already there. He was sitting at the kitchen table, a mug of something warm in his hands. He looked up as I entered, but didn't smile. "I made tea," he said. "There's some left if you want." I nodded, stepping into the kitchen. I poured myself a cup. Sat across from him. Neither of us spoke for a while. The silence was different now. Less performative. Less protective. Eventually, I broke it. "I think we need time," I said. "Real time. To figure out if we're still holding on to something that's already gone." He nodded slowly. "I've been thinking the same thing." We didn't cry. We didn't argue. We just sat with the truth. And it didn't feel like an ending. It felt like an opening. A long-awaited exhale. Later that night, as I stood in the doorway of the bedroom, watching him pack a small bag with quiet precision, I felt a strange sense of peace. Not because I had all the answers. Not because the future was suddenly clear. But because, for the first time in years, I had stopped pretending. I closed the door softly behind me and walked into the darkened hallway, letting it swallow the sound of my footsteps. Outside, the rain had returned. And for the first time, I didn't flinch.